Under Article 294 of the Philippine Labor Code, every employee is guaranteed security of tenure. To lawfully pierce that security and terminate a worker, an employer must prove a legally recognized, just, or authorized cause. The limits of this protection were tested in a legal dispute between International Container Terminal Services, or ICTSI, and its employee, Melvin C. Ang. ICTSI operates a logistics network, managing multi-billion-dollar investments in port subsidiaries worldwide. Inside this operation, Ang worked as the SAP BPC administrator. This role gave him sole administrative access to the global financial reporting software the company used to track its investments. The conflict began when ICTSI accused Ang of negligence, claiming his failure to perform assigned tasks delayed critical reports for the CFO. The situation escalated when Ang took an unauthorized leave of absence during a critical software implementation phase. ICTSI fired him. But when Ang sued for illegal dismissal, both the National Labor Relations Commission and the Court of Appeals ruled in his favor. The appellate court ordered ICTSI to pay Ang his full back wages and a separation pay penalty. To overturn this decision at the Supreme Court, the company had to prove they navigated a two-pronged legal test, utilizing a specific shift in the burden of proof. This flowchart illustrates the two prongs an employer must satisfy for a lawful termination: substantive due process and procedural due process. Substantive due process dictates that the employer must have a valid, statutory reason to fire the worker. ICTSI invoked Article 297, Paragraph C, loss of trust and confidence. This standard requires two conditions. First, the employee must hold a position of trust. Second, there must be a verifiable act justifying the destruction of that trust. Evaluating the first condition, Ang argued his formal job title was assistant manager, implying a lower tier of corporate responsibility. The Supreme Court rejected this. Legal classification depends on the actual work performed, not the job title on the contract. Ang possessed the skills to maintain the company's global reporting framework. He had unilateral power to authorize or limit system access for end users worldwide. The court determined these duties constitute the execution of management policies, fulfilling the legal definition of a managerial employee. Because Ang was legally recognized as a manager, the threshold required to prove his misconduct shifted in the employer's favor. The law bifurcates the burden of proof based on rank. For rank-and-file workers, it demands strict proof of involvement. But for managers, the employer only needs to establish a reasonable basis to believe a breach occurred. The court explicitly states that proving the misconduct beyond a reasonable doubt is not required for managers. Applying this lighter standard begins with Ang's unauthorized leave of absence. Ang argued that because he texted his supervisor and received no reply, he assumed the leave was approved. The court dismissed this. For a high-level administrator handling sensitive data, assuming silence equals approval violates the fidelity expected of the role. The same standard governs the evidence regarding the unresolved system errors. ICTSI produced multiple emails documenting technical issues that Ang left unanswered. Ang claimed the emails were misleading and that the errors fell outside his immediate daily tasks. The Supreme Court dismantled this defense. As the overarching SAP administrator, the ultimate responsibility for system failures fell on him. Under the managerial standard, the emails and text messages provided a reasonable basis for ICTSI to lose trust in Ang, satisfying substantive due process. A valid reason for termination is insufficient on its own. Failing to follow the correct administrative procedure renders the dismissal flawed. This checklist outlines the two-notice rule. Step 1. Furnish a written notice detailing the specific grounds for dismissal. ICTSI served notices on March 4th and March 20th. Step 2. The notice must direct the employee to submit a written explanation. Ang submitted his formal written response on March 11th. Step 3. Provide an opportunity to be heard. ICTSI invited Ang to and conducted 2 separate administrative hearings to discuss his infractions. Step 4. Serve a final written notice of dismissal. The procedural timeline is binary. ICTSI either met the statutory deadlines or they didn't, and the records show they did. With the timeline verified, we return to the history of the dispute. Ultimately, the Supreme Court evaluated the conflicting decisions of the lower courts. The court reversed and set aside the rulings of the Court of Appeals and the NLRC. Because ICTSI satisfied substantive due process, through the managerial burden of proof and met procedural due process requirements, the dismissal was declared valid. This reversal removed the financial penalties imposed by the appellate courts. The court reinforced the doctrine that an employee dismissed based on a valid, willful breach of trust forfeits any right to separation pay. The back wages and attorney's fees were also extinguished by the finding of a just cause. Employers possess wide managerial prerogative to terminate fiduciary employees, but this power only holds up in court if they anchor the decision in substantial evidence and follow the procedural framework.